The North Atlantic, February 1942. A Wolfpack commander named Eric Topp is staring through his periscope at what should be the easiest kill of his career. A straggling merchantman, low in the water, smoke trailing from a damaged funnel. 3,000 yards, calm sea. A textbook setup. Topp has sunk 34 ships already. He knows this dance. Then the merchantman vanishes. Not literally, she's still there, wallowing along at 6 knots, but the small grey shape that detaches itself from her flank, squat, ugly, barely longer than a cricket pitch, that's the problem. Topp's first officer mutters a single word into the conning tower. Silence. Corvette. Corvette. And every man on U-552 knows what comes next, because they've heard the stories whispered in the bars of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire. The destroyer captains, the Royal Navy regulars with their gleaming buttons and proper procedures, those you could outwit. Those followed the manual. The corvette captains followed no manual at all. Topp orders a crash dive. The chief engineer hesitates for half a second. They're at maximum periscope depth. The boat is sluggish. The battery's low after a week of patrol. Half a second is enough. The little ship up top, HMS Bluebell, a Flower-class corvette commanded by a former merchant mariner named Robert Sherwood, who took his ticket on a Liverpool tramp steamer in 1928, has already turned. Sherwood doesn't ask permission. He doesn't signal the convoy commodore. He simply rings down for full ahead and aims his bow at the swirl where the periscope was. His sonar rating, an 18-year-old from Aberdeen who had never seen the sea before the war, calls out the bearing in a voice that hasn't fully broken. The first depth charges go over the stern 11 seconds later. Down in U-552, Topp grips the chart table as the boat shudders. He has fought Royal Navy destroyers from the Tribal class to the V and W. He has been hunted by American four-stackers and Canadian River-class frigates. None of them frighten him the way this does. A destroyer captain, a regular RN officer, will hunt by the book. He will lay a precise pattern. He will reacquire contact methodically. You can predict him. You can wait him out at 300 feet, hold your breath, count the screws, slip away in the bubble of his own propeller wash. You cannot predict a corvette captain, because most of them aren't Royal Navy at all. This is the secret that Whitehall worked very hard to conceal during the war, and that historians have only properly understood in the decades since. The corvette force that broke the back of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was not, in the conventional sense, a navy. It was a flotilla of trawlermen, deep-sea fishermen, ferry captains, tugboat masters, and merchant officers, men who had spent their lives in small, awkward ships in dreadful weather, men who knew the Atlantic in a way no Dartmouth graduate ever could. The Admiralty gave them reserve and volunteer reserve commissions, handed them a 1,000-ton ship with 1 4-inch gun and a depth charge rail, and turned them loose. The Germans called them Die wilden Engländer, the wild English. And by 1943, the Kriegsmarine's own analysis would conclude, in a report Karl Dönitz never let circulate beyond his immediate staff, that a U-boat captain's chances of survival against a corvette escort were roughly half what they were against a destroyer screen. How did the ugliest little ships of the war become the thing that German submariners feared most? The answer begins, as so many wartime answers do, in a panicked meeting at the Admiralty in the autumn of 1939. Britain, in September 1939, was a maritime nation with a maritime crisis it had refused for almost 2 decades to take seriously. The Royal Navy was still nominally the largest in the world, but its strength was a Victorian inheritance papered over with interwar economies. The Geddes Acts, the Washington and London naval treaties, the 10-year rule, and the long deflationary grip of the Treasury under Neville Chamberlain had left the fleet structurally unbalanced. Britain had battleships. Britain had aircraft carriers in numbers, even if the aircraft aboard them were obsolete. What Britain did not have, in anything like sufficient quantity, was small escort vessels capable of shepherding merchant convoys across the Atlantic. The reason for this gap was not stupidity, it was doctrine. The Admiralty, between the wars, had convinced itself that the convoy system of 1917 and 1918 had been a temporary expedient. ASDIC, the new underwater detection device perfected at HMS Osprey in Portland, was believed to have rendered the submarine obsolete. As late as 1937, the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Ernley Chatfield, told the Committee of Imperial Defence that the U-boat threat could be regarded as essentially solved. The Naval Staff's war games consistently assumed that any future Atlantic campaign would be a matter of weeks rather than years, and that a handful of destroyers, sloops, and the aging V and W class veterans of the Great War would suffice. Within 10 days of Hitler's invasion of Poland, this assumption lay in pieces on the floor of room 39 at the Admiralty. The liner, Athenia, had been torpedoed 250 miles northwest of Ireland on the very evening war was declared. By the end of September, the carrier HMS Courageous was on the bottom of the western approaches with 519 of her crew. On the 14th of October, Günther Prien took U-47 into Scapa Flow itself and sank the battleship Royal Oak at her moorings, killing 835 men, many of them boys under 18. Whitehall responded with the particular cocktail of panic and pragmatism that the British political class reserves for genuine emergencies. Winston Churchill, returned to the Admiralty as First Lord, walked into a department that was, in his own private phrase to his wife, 30 years behind its enemies and 20 behind its friends. He demanded numbers. How many escorts did the Navy have? How many were needed? The Director of Plans, Captain Victor Dankworts, gave him an answer that Churchill insisted be put in writing and locked in the safe. At the current rate of construction and loss, Britain would lose the Atlantic War by the summer of 1941. The War Cabinet, sitting in the half-built basement at Storey's Gate, faced a problem that no amount of strategic ingenuity could solve quickly. Building proper warships took years. Britain did not have years. She did not even have months. The Atlantic Lifeline carried not only food and oil, but every cartridge, every aeroplane engine, every ton of nickel and tungsten and rubber that kept the war effort moving. Lose that lifeline, and the question of fighting Germany became academic, because there would be nothing to fight her with. The answer, when it came, did not come from the naval staff. It came from a Yorkshireman named William Reed, the chief designer at Smith's Dock Company on the Tees, who had spent the 1930s designing whale catchers for the Antarctic whaling fleet. Reed's whale catcher, the Southern Pride, was a tough little vessel of about 1,000 tons, with a single triple expansion engine, a reinforced bow for ice, and the capacity to ride out weather that would break the back of a destroyer. In November 1939, the Admiralty asked him whether he could militarize his design. Reed replied that he could have the first hull on the slip within a fortnight. The Flower-class Corvette was about to be born. The order went out from Bath, where the Department of Naval Construction had been evacuated on the 31st of January 1940. 145 hulls in the first program. They would be built not in the great yards of the Clyde and the Tyne. Those were reserved for cruisers, destroyers, and the new King George V class battleships. But in the smaller commercial yards, Harland, and Wolfe at Belfast, Smith's Dock itself at South Bank, Hall Russell at Aberdeen, Yarrow on the Clyde's south bank, Crown at Sunderland, and a dozen more. Yards that knew how to build trawlers and colliers and tramp steamers. Yards full of men who had never built a warship in their lives. The specifications, when they were finalized, made the regular Royal Navy wince. Length 205 feet, beam 33 feet. One 4-inch low-angle gun forward of a pattern dating from the Great War. 2 single Lewis guns, 40 depth charges in racks and throwers astern, a single shaft, 16 knots flat out, less in any kind of seaway, no armour, no fire control system to speak of, a bridge wide open to the weather because Reed's whale catchers had needed clear sight lines for the harpooner. The first lieutenant of HMS Gladiolus, a regular RN officer named Roger Hill, took one look at his new command in July 1940 and remarked dryly that he had been given charge of a corkscrew with a gun on it. But the corkscrew floated, and the corkscrew could be built in 6 months by men who would otherwise be building nothing at all. By the end of 1940, 26 were in commission. By the end of 1941, the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy together had over 100. The problem was the crews. There were no crews, or rather, there were no regular naval crews available. Every trained destroyer hand was already at sea, and the destroyer building program was consuming the output of the training establishments at Plymouth and Portsmouth faster than they could fill it. The Admiralty turned, as it had done in 1914, to the Royal Naval Reserve, the merchant officers, and to the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, the weekend yachtsmen, and the bank clerks who had spent their summers in dinghies on the Solent. By 1942, over 90% of Corvette officers were RNR or RNVR. Their captains, in many cases, had never seen the inside of a naval college. What they had seen was weather. The typical flower class captain in 1941 was a man in his late 30s or early 40s who had spent 15 years in command of something. A trawler out of Hull, a coaster running between Belfast and Liverpool, a tug on the Mersey, a steam drifter chasing herring off Lerwick. He knew how a small ship behaved in a force 9 gale in a way that no career destroyer officer ever could, because destroyer officers spent their gales below, with the ship buttoned up, riding it out. Trawlermen worked through gales. They had to. The fish were running. While Smith's Dock was hammering out hulls on the Tees, the man who would shortly become their principal enemy was reorganizing his own command 300 miles across the North Sea. Karl Dönitz, commander of submarines, had moved his headquarters from Wilhelmshaven to a requisitioned villa at Carnival, near Lorient, on the Brittany coast. From this house, with its hand-coloured Atlantic chart on the dining room wall, Dönitz directed the Rudeltaktik, the wolf pack, which by the autumn of 1940 had already begun what his crews called die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. The happy time was about to end. Dönitz did not yet know it, but neither did Whitehall. The first hint that something unusual was happening in the Atlantic reached the Operational Intelligence Centre at the Admiralty in the early hours of the 6th of March, 1941. A flower-class corvette, HMS Camellia, commanded by a 41-year-old RNR lieutenant named A.C. Aldred, who had spent the 1930s running a coaster between Liverpool and Dublin, had attacked and apparently sunk U-70 south of Iceland while escorting convoy OB-293. The attack itself was unremarkable, a standard depth charge pattern over an ASDIC contact. What was remarkable was what had happened next. Aldred had not waited for orders. He had not signaled the senior officer of the escort, Commander James Rowland, in the destroyer HMS Wolverine. He had not, in fact, done any of the things the anti-submarine warfare manual required him to do. Instead, observing that his initial pattern had produced an oil slick but no certain kill, he had circled tightly, ignored a second ASDIC contact, and laid a deliberate trap by stopping his engines and drifting silent for 40 minutes. A maneuver nowhere in the manual, but standard practice for a trawlerman waiting out a shoal of skittish herring. When U-70's captain Joachim Matz brought his boat back to periscope depth to check for surface contacts, the only thing on the surface was Camellia, motionless, 300 yards away, with her 4-inch gun trained and loaded. The destroyer Wolverine, summoned by Camelia's signal, finished the job. But the kill belonged, in every meaningful sense, to a Liverpool coaster captain with 2 years of naval training. This was the pattern that began, very quietly, to repeat. In March 1941, Wu 99, Otto Kretschmer, the leading ace of the Kriegsmarine, with 270,000 tons to his credit, was forced to the surface and captured by a destroyer Corvette team. In April, HMS Gladiolus and HMS Hibiscus drove U-65 down and held her there until her batteries failed. In May, the Bismarck operation overshadowed everything, but in the same month, no fewer than 5 U-boats were lost to escort action in which corvettes played the principal role. The Operational Research Section at the Admiralty, under Professor Patrick Blackett, began to notice something the regular naval staff had missed. Blackett, a former Royal Navy officer turned physicist who would win the Nobel Prize in 1948, ran the numbers in his characteristic way, dispassionately, statistically, without regard for tradition. The kill ratios told a story. Destroyer escorts, on average, achieved approximately 1 U-boat sunk for every 4 sustained contacts. Corvette escorts achieved 1 for every 2.5. The destroyer was the faster, better armed, more sophisticated ship. The Corvette was killing more submarines per opportunity. Blackett's report, submitted to the First Sea Lord, Sir Dudley Pound, in August 1941, identified 3 reasons. First, corvettes spent more time at sea in heavy weather because they were designed for it. Destroyers, with their fine lines and high freeboard forward, suffered structural damage in conditions that a corvette merely rolled through. Second, corvettes carried more depth charges per ton displacement than destroyers because they carried almost nothing else. Third, and this was the finding that mattered most, corvette captains were making tactical decisions that violated the manual but produced results. Pound was skeptical. He was a regular officer of the old school, and the idea that reserve lieutenants were outperforming his trained destroyer captains struck him as statistically suspect at best and dangerous to morale at worst. He buried the report. But Blackett, who had powerful friends at Chequers, including Lord Cherwell, made sure a copy reached the Prime Minister. Churchill read it on a Sunday morning at the end of August. By the Tuesday, a directive had gone out to Western Approach's command at Liverpool, where a new commander-in-chief had just taken up his post. His name was Admiral Sir Percy Noble. He was about to change the war. Convoy ONS.5 sailed from Liverpool on the 22nd of April, 1943. 43 merchant ships, mostly bound for Halifax in ballast, carrying nothing more valuable than empty hulls and the men who manned them. The escort group was Escort Group B7, commanded by a man whose name has somehow escaped the popular memory of the Battle of the Atlantic and ought not to have done, Commander Peter Gretton, Royal Navy. But the real story of ONS.5 is not Gretton, distinguished though he was. It is the corvettes. B7 consisted of 2 destroyers, Gretton's own Duncan and the elderly Vedette, 2 frigates, and 4 Flower-class corvettes, Snowflake, Sunflower, Lucistrife, and Pink. Pink was commanded by a Lieutenant Atkinson, RNR, a man who had spent the 1930s as a deck officer on the Anchor Line's India run. Lucistrife was commanded by Lieutenant Stonehouse, RNR, formerly of the Manchester Ship Canal Company. Sunflower was under Lieutenant Commander Plomer, a Canadian, a tugboat master from Vancouver. Snowflake was under Lieutenant Chesterman, RNR. Not a Dartmouth graduate among them, the weather, by the 4th of May, was atrocious. A full gale from the northwest, sea state 7. Visibility under a mile in driving rain. The convoy had been spread over 50 miles of ocean by the storm. At Dönitz, his cipher staff at Lorient, reading the convoy's position from their U-boat sightings, concentrated 41 submarines, the largest wolf pack of the war, across its predicted track. He told his commanders, in a signal intercepted and decrypted at Bletchley Park within 4 hours of transmission, that ONS .5 was to be annihilated. Vernichtet. What followed, over the next 4 nights, was the most concentrated single engagement of the Atlantic War. The U-boats attacked in waves, on the surface, at night, in conditions where ASDIC was almost useless and radar was degraded by sea return. 13 merchant ships went down in the first 3 nights. The escort group seemed to be drowning under sheer weight of numbers. Then the weather changed. Or rather, the corvettes changed the weather. On the night of the 5th, with Gretton himself forced to detach Duncan due to fuel shortage, command of the close escort fell on the senior corvette captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherwood. Yes, the same Sherwood from the opening scene of this story, now commanding Tay. Sherwood had no signal book authority to do what he did next. He ordered the 4 corvettes to form a tight ring round the surviving merchantman and to attack any radar contact aggressively, regardless of range, regardless of pattern, regardless of whether they could reacquire after the first run. Throw the depth charges. Throw them again. Keep the U-boats under. Do not let them surface to attack. Over the next 36 hours, in conditions that should have favored the submarines absolutely, B7's corvettes sank U638, U125, U438, U531, and U192, and damaged 7 more so badly that they had to break off and return to base. Pink, the smallest and slowest ship in the group, sank U192 single-handed in a snowstorm. Atkinson conning his ship from the open bridge in oilskins for the 11th consecutive hour. His ASDIC operator, a 19-year-old from Hull who had been on a fishing trawler 18 months earlier. Dönitz, reading the situation reports at Carnival on the morning of the 6th, did something he had not done in 3 years of war. He ordered his U-boats to break contact and withdraw. The signal, intercepted and decoded at Bletchley by lunchtime, went straight to the Admiralty and from there to Chequers. Churchill read it standing up. He passed it without speaking to General Brooke. The Battle of the Atlantic, though no one yet knew it, had just been won. The price had been ruinous, and it had been paid in the main by men whose names are not carved on any of the great memorials. Between September 1939 and May 1945, the Royal Navy lost 36 Flower-class corvettes to enemy action, mine, or weather. Another 23 were damaged so severely that they spent more time in dockyard hands than at sea. The Royal Canadian Navy, which by 1943 was operating more flowers than the Royal Navy itself, lost a further 10. The crews that went down with them were overwhelmingly reserve and volunteer reserve. fishermen from Hull and Grimsby, dock workers from Liverpool and Cardiff, schoolmasters from Edinburgh, accountants from Birmingham, farm boys from County Cork who had walked off the bog and into a recruiting office in Belfast. The casualty rate, ton for ton, was higher than that of any other class of vessel in the Royal Navy. A Flower-class corvette in continuous Atlantic service in 1942 had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of losing a man overboard on any given crossing, before any contact with the enemy. The bridge, open to the weather, claimed more lives through exposure and hypothermia than through enemy action. Frostbite, trench foot, and what the Navy still officially called exhaustion neurosis, what we now call combat stress, and what the men themselves simply called going ASDIC happy, sent more corvette ratings home unfit for further service than U-boats did. There was a quieter cost too, one that did not appear in the official histories until they began to be declassified in the 1970s. The Anti-Submarine Warfare Manual was a closely guarded document. Every tactical innovation a corvette captain made was, in theory, a breach of standing orders. Several were court-martialed. At least 2, both RNR officers, had successful U-boat actions struck from their service records on technical grounds because they had attacked without authorization. The Royal Navy of 1941 to 1943 was an institution at war with itself almost as bitterly as it was at war with Germany. The regulars resented the reservists. The destroyer crews looked down on the corvette crews. The corvette captains, when they came ashore at Derry or Liverpool, drank in different pubs. The intelligence dimension was equally fraught. The cracking of the German naval enigma at Bletchley Park, the work of Alan Turing, Hugh Alexander, and the others in Hut 8, gave the Admiralty an unprecedented window into U-boat operations from the spring of 1941 onwards. But that window could only be exploited by ships at sea. The decrypts told the OIC where the U-boats were. It was the corvette captain in the snowstorm at 3 a.m. who had to do something about it. The special intelligence summaries that reached western approaches were of no use whatever to a ship rolling through a force 9 gale with a sonar contact at green 45 and a depth charge crew working in the dark. What Britain learned, slowly and at terrible price, was a lesson her senior service had not really absorbed since the days of Nelson. That command in small ships in difficult conditions was a different art from command in large ships in fleet actions, and that the men best suited to it were not necessarily the men the Naval College at Dartmouth was producing. Lord Cherwell, in a private minute to Churchill in November 1943, put it more bluntly than any First Sea Lord ever would. The corvettes, he wrote, had been won by amateurs against professionals because the amateurs had refused to fight the professionals' war. Pound did not see the minute. He was dying of a brain tumour and would resign in October 1943, replaced by Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who was, if anything, even less inclined to credit the reserve. The official Admiralty history of the Atlantic campaign, when it was finally written by Captain Stephen Roskill in the 1950s, gave the corvette force a respectful but distinctly minor place in the narrative. That has only begun to be corrected in the present century. The Flower-class corvette did not survive the war as a major warship type. By 1944, it was already being supplanted by the larger River-class frigates, and eventually by the Castle and Loch classes, ships designed from the keel up for the Atlantic roll with proper enclosed bridges, better armament, and longer range. The last operational Flower in Royal Navy service paid off in 1947. Many were sold for scrap. A handful went to foreign navies, Argentina, Greece, the Dominican Republic, where some served into the 1970s. One HMCS Sackville survives today as a museum ship at Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is the last of her kind in the world. The men who had commanded them dispersed, mostly, back into the lives they had left in 1939. The trawlermen returned to their fishing grounds. The coaster captains went back to their coasters. A few stayed in the post-war Navy, mostly in administrative roles. The regulars had little appetite for promoting reserve officers, however distinguished, once peacetime promotion boards resumed their normal patterns. Robert Sherwood retired to Cheshire in 1946 and died in 1972 with one paragraph in the Liverpool Echo and no national obituary. Atkinson of Pink went back to the Anchor Line and was master of the SS Cilicia by 1953. Plomer of Sunflower returned to the Vancouver tugboat trade. The strategic consequences were more lasting, though they took some years to become visible. The Royal Navy's official thinking on anti-submarine warfare in the 1950s, shaped by the experience of 1939 to 1945, drove the design of the Type 12 Whitby-class frigate and her successors. These were small ships, by international standards, optimized for the Atlantic. They were the Corvette's grandchildren. When the question arose in 1948 of how Britain should contribute to the maritime defence of the new North Atlantic Alliance, the answer that emerged from the naval staff at the Admiralty and was endorsed by the Attlee government's Defence Committee was, in essence, that Britain would specialise. The Americans would build the big ocean fleet. Britain would build the escorts. Britain would hold the North Atlantic gap. This division of labour, entirely consistent with the Corvette experience, would define the Royal Navy's role in NATO for the next 40 years. It is the reason that, even in the depths of the post-Suez retreat, Britain continued to build frigates when she had stopped building almost everything else. It is the reason that the Cold War Royal Navy, by the 1970s, had effectively become a specialized anti-submarine force, with the largest concentration of frigates and ASW capability in NATO outside the United States Navy. There was a cultural consequence too, slower to develop, but in the end perhaps more important. The Reserve and Volunteer Reserve, having proved itself in the Atlantic in a way no peacetime exercise could have demonstrated, became a permanent and respected part of the Royal Navy's order of battle. The RNR of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, staffed largely by merchant officers and trained on minesweepers and inshore patrol vessels, drew directly on the Corvette tradition. When the Falklands crisis broke in April 1982 and the Royal Navy had to assemble a task force at extraordinary speed, the ships taken up from trade program, which converted Canberra, Atlantic Conveyor, Uganda, and dozens of others into warships within days, was run by men whose grandfathers had served in Flowers. And the special relationship, in its naval dimension, carried the Corvette inheritance with it. American escort doctrine in the Atlantic from 1942 onwards was shaped, sometimes against the institutional resistance of the United States Navy, by British example. The convoy battles, the escort group concept, the integration of escorts with maritime patrol aircraft, the use of operational research, all of it flowed westwards across the Atlantic from the Admiralty's offices in Whitehall. The Americans, in time, would build a better navy than Britain ever could, but they built it on a British template. What does this story actually tell us? Beyond the immediate facts of ships and crews and depth charges in the cold dark of the North Atlantic, it tells us something about how Britain fights. Not, in the end, with the largest forces, or the most sophisticated equipment, or the most polished doctrine. Britain, in her wars, has tended to win, when she has won, by improvising at extraordinary speed under genuine pressure, by drawing on civilian skills and civilian institutions in ways no other great power has quite mastered, and by being willing, sometimes against the screaming resistance of her own services, to let amateurs do work that the professionals had previously claimed as their own. The Flower-class corvette was an ugly ship. Her sailors said she would roll on wet grass. She was wet, cold, slow, undergunned, and built in yards that had never seen an Admiralty pennant before 1939. She was crewed by men who, in any properly organized peacetime navy, would never have set foot on a warship's bridge. And she, more than any single weapon system in the British arsenal, won the Battle of the Atlantic, which is to say that she made every other British victory of the Second World War possible. Without the convoys, no Eighth Army in the desert, no bomber command over Germany, no D-Day, no Burma campaign, no Britain in the war at all by 1942. It is worth remembering, when we look at the modern Royal Navy with its handful of immensely sophisticated frigates and its struggle to maintain escort numbers for 2 aircraft carriers, that the lesson of the Flower class is precisely the lesson the Treasury has always found hardest to learn. Quality matters. But quantity has a quality of its own, particularly in maritime warfare, particularly against a determined submarine adversary, and particularly when the geography of the threat, as it is again becoming in the North Atlantic in the 2020s, with Russian submarine activity at Cold War levels, is precisely the geography that broke and was broken by the Corvette force 80 years ago. There is a memorial at the Western Approaches Museum in Liverpool, in the old underground command centre on Rumford Street, where Sir Percy Noble and later Sir Max Horton ran the Atlantic War. It is a simple list of names. The men of the escort groups, most of them reserve, most of them in their 20s, most of them with no grave but the sea. If you ever find yourself in Liverpool, go and stand in front of it for a few minutes. The names will not mean anything to you. They did not mean anything to the country at the time either. That was, in a strange way, their strength. They were not heroes in the Nelsonian mould. They were just men who knew small ships in bad weather, and they did the job because somebody had to do it, and the somebody available was them. That, perhaps, is the deepest British military tradition of them all. Not the glorious charge, not the brilliant strategist, just the right person, in the right place, doing the necessary thing without much fuss, in conditions no one would freely choose, for as long as is required. So, the U-boat captain who feared the corvette more than the destroyer was not being irrational. He was reading the war correctly, in a way many in Whitehall took years longer to do. If this story moved you, or surprised you, or made you see the Battle of the Atlantic in a different light, do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps us keep producing these in-depth examinations of Britain's 20th century wars. And in the comments below, I would very much like to hear your view. Was the corvette captain's advantage really one of seamanship and character, as the reservists themselves believed? Or was it something the Admiralty understood all along and chose, for institutional reasons, not to admit? Tell me what you think.